and welcome to my channel where we mainly discuss thrillers on Thursdays, and I'm very excited because it's the end of the month. It's the last Thursday of the month, which means today we're going to be discussing this month's Year of Horror Book Club book. If somehow you're subscribed to my channel and you don't know what the Year of Horror Book Club is, at just a high level, we're either reading horror novels or books about horrifying topics. I'll have a link to the initial video where I explain it down below, as well as some other information. But just like in the last Year of Horror Book Club video, this video has 3 parts. So for part 1, we're going to be talking about the next 2 months' reads, and then we're going to get into a spoiler-free discussion of PENPAL, and then we'll have a spoiler-filled discussion of PENPAL. If you want to just skip to certain sections, I will have timestamps down below. So as I said in last month's video, I already gave you guys a heads up that next month we are going to be reading Pet Sematary. My copy came in. It's very old, kind of falling apart, and I think mine was written in 1983, which was when it came out, or excuse me, 1984, so a year after it came out. But even though it's kind of falling apart, I do love it. And like I said in my last video, we're reading this in March because in the beginning of April the movie of this comes out, so that way we can watch that together. And for April's Year of Horror Book Club pick, this is a book, I'm gonna grab it, that a lot of you guys recommended on Twitter a few months back when I initially asked for what you guys wanted to read, and a couple of people in the Discord group, which I'll have linked down below, also recommended this. I really wanted to read some Japanese horror, and we might read another one down the road too, but I'm so excited about this one. So April's Year of Horror Book Club book is In the Miso Soup by Reivew Murakami. Now I know some of you have probably already read it. It's going to be impossible for us to ever have a book that none of you have read before. If you read it, then you're just really ahead of the game. But if you don't know what this is about, it takes place in Tokyo, and a serial killer is terrorizing Tokyo, and a man named Kenji, he's Japanese, is hired to show around an American businessman just around Tokyo for 3 nights, just kind of show a foreigner the city. And Frank is apparently an overweight American tourist, and during those 3 nights Kenji begins to suspect more and more that this fat American tourist Frank is the serial killer. So it sounds really disturbing. It's also a pretty quick read. It's only, what is it, a little over 200 pages, so it hopefully won't be stressful to get to even if you wait until the last week to read it. So I hope you guys are excited to read this one, and thank you to all of you who recommended it. Whew. Okay, now we're gonna get into the spoiler-free review of PENPAL, where as always we'll go through summary, pros, and cons before I get into the spoiler discussion. So at a high level for what this is about, I was super excited to get into PENPAL, and I have a lot of mixed thoughts about it, I'll just say up front, because so many of you have recommended this to me for years. And when I initially asked on Twitter for what books you guys wanted to read for the book club, this was one of the top 3 that was definitely recommended to me. And if you don't know how this book originally started, I'll give you some context because it has a huge cult following. So it initially started on Reddit, I believe in No Sleep. If you just type in Reddit PENPAL, it'll pop right up, and it was kind of a serial where every chapter in this book was posted one at a time, so people were kind of waiting for the next chapter to come out. Very exciting. And then eventually it got so popular that the author decided to self-publish the book. And without giving anything away, PENPAL is about a little boy who has a class project where they have to each get a balloon and write a note saying, you know, after they release the balloon, whoever finds it, please send a letter to the teacher of the school so that we can know where the balloon landed. It's a very exciting school project, although I don't feel like in 2019 that project would fly. Pun intended, but not surprisingly, the narrator releases his balloon, and then a very creepy PENPAL starts to contact him. So first, in terms of pros, I really adored the tone of this book and a lot of the creepy imagery. The author, I think, really has a knack for making things that generally wouldn't be creepy terrifying. Like there's a scene where the narrator's a little boy and he's in the woods and he looks over and there's a pool float that's a shark. And generally you wouldn't have a visceral reaction and be like, oh my god, it's a pool float. But somehow just the tone of the book, you really feel like you are in a nightmare. And I will say, this is one of the few times where I had a nightmare because of a book. So the book really did get to me, and I can definitely understand why it has a cult following. And if you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about, but at the end of each chapter, there's I don't know if I would necessarily call it a twist. Often it is a twist, but there's kind of just the last 2 lines have a lot of shock factor. You can tell that's what the author intends. And especially during the first half of the book, I really did think it landed, and I thought it was very scary and shocking, and I would kind of look forward to getting to the last page because I was excited to be shocked about what was going to be revealed. And those were all my pros, so now we're going to get into the cons. I was looking in the Discord group, and a lot of us had similar thoughts for the aspects that we disliked, which was overall, and this is hard to describe without spoiling it, but I won't, but there are a lot of aspects that were confusing that I don't think were intended to be confusing. You know, if for example, a lot of horror novels, a lot of thrillers, their endings, you finish them and then you want to discuss it because it's confusing and you don't necessarily understand why things happen. That's very common in horror novels and thrillers, but there are aspects that I think are maybe even just editorial errors in the book that just make it a little confusing. And I do understand that to a certain extent it is supposed to be confusing. It's supposed to feel like a nightmare and like a child is trying to remember what happened. And I just realized I forgot to say that aspect in the summary. This is told from the point of view of when he's older, looking back on his childhood and kind of trying to piece together what happened. But for example, there's a picture of like police notes at one point in the book, and I didn't understand why that helped or added anything to the story. I kept reading them being like, am I supposed to get something out of this? And so sometimes it was just a little confusing when I don't think it was really supposed to be. And like I said, a lot of the ends of each chapter, actually I would say every single ending of every chapter has a twist or some kind of shock factor, and I thought in the first half of the book that shock factor really landed, and it was really creepy and shocking, and you know, I wanted to discuss it with people immediately. But towards, you know, the end of the book, the last couple 2-3 chapters, I was more just like, what? Like, it didn't really scare me or shock me, it just started confusing me. I feel like this book would have just been so much better if it had had an editor, which I do understand isn't necessarily a fair critique because, you know, it's really impressive that he got this self-published and that it had so many people excited to read it. You know, I get it. So it's a little rude for me to be like, you should have paid for an editor. I get it, but I still think it could have used a little bit more editing. So overall, I thought this was a lot of creepy fun, even though sometimes I thought it could use some editing. So overall, I will give PENPAL 3 out of 5 creepy branches. Overall, as I said, I'm really happy that I read it. I understand why so many of you guys love it and recommended it. I get why it has a cult following. I just think the format I probably would have enjoyed more if I had actually just read it on Reddit and read each section along with the comments as it was posted. I mean, I know I can't go back in time and make that happen, but I think that experience was probably a lot better of an experience than just picking up the actual novel and reading it. I'm gonna put this down, my hand's getting tired, and now let's get into the spoiler section. So if you have not read PENPAL, feel free to exit out now. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts, which I know you guys do too, and before I get into some other things I want to talk about, I guess I should say what my interpretation of the ending was, just so we kind of have like a place to start off at. So the way I interpreted the ending, at least, was that the pen pal, or this man, was really obsessed with the narrator, but he kind of picked Josh as kind of a substitute since it's mentioned that they looked similar, kidnapped him, made him look like the narrator, held him captive for a couple years doing God knows what, I don't want to think about it. And then the pen pal, this man, kills Veronica and then tricks Josh's dad into burying him and Josh alive. Once they're buried, Josh bites the man's throat, thereby killing the man. And then unfortunately, Josh dies a much worse death than that, I assume suffocating and dying much more slowly, entombed alive. But one thing I do want to kind of remind myself, and this I kind of realized yesterday, was even though the ending was confusing, I feel like we got at least a lot more answers than I personally was expecting. You know, it's kind of hinted at, is this sort of a beast? Is it a man? What is this thing that's stalking him? And so the fact that it's just an ordinary man, one, I think makes it more terrifying because it's more or less saying these types of things could really happen, but it also meant that we got a lot more answers than I was expecting. I really thought the book was going to be more open-ended, so I was honestly kind of surprised that we got as many answers as we did. But as I was saying in the spoiler-free review, some aspects were just needlessly confusing. I had a lot of trouble following where we were in the timeline. I had a lot of trouble understanding why those police notes were at the very end of the book. I read those 3 times expecting that maybe something extra was going to be revealed and that was, the final conclusion. Please let me know if there is something. I really want to know. I'll gladly admit if I missed something. I really thought, in looking back on this, that just doesn't make any sense. But I thought, reading the police notes initially when I saw Josh's name, I kind of thought, oh wait, maybe the twist is that the whole time he was actually stalking Josh, but that doesn't really make sense. Some parts also just really didn't make sense to me, like when the mom is like, wait, you didn't realize Veronica's been dead for weeks? How would he know that? It's a mother and son living together. How would that not have come up in conversation over the past week? So it kind of felt like the narrator, and someone said this in the Discord group and I really agree, it kind of felt like he had twists and surprises he had already thought of, and so he thought of plot points to try and make those twists be able to occur, and sometimes it just wasn't developed enough and didn't really make sense to me. I talked about the parts that were confusing that I thought shouldn't have been confusing, but one aspect that I think was left vague that I actually really liked was Mrs. Maggie, and I think that's an example of something that was well done because it was creepy. I don't necessarily understand why it was in the book, but at the same time, since we're supposed to be in the mindset of the narrator looking back on his childhood, you generally can't remember your childhood that much and that clearly. You can kind of understand that when she says Tom's home, it's probably the stalker pretending to be Tom. Then I assume, of course, that when the police are taking out the bags, it's probably her body chopped up. But a little bit is still left to the imagination, and so I thought that was an aspect that was done well. And then, like I was saying in the spoiler-free review, some of the aspects that I thought could have used some editing. There's a line at the end of the book, you know what? I'm too lazy to look it up. There's a line where after Josh's dad finds his body, a few paragraphs later, the author says something like, but Josh's parents, they never found out their son was dead. And I was like, yes, the dad did at least. Like, he found him, and I kept rereading it. And so things like that were just worded strangely. And I was like, well, maybe he was talking about that before he buried them alive, the dad didn't realize he was dead. Maybe something like that, but it was just, again, some parts were confusing and I think not intentionally so. So overall, those are my thoughts on PENPAL. Please let me know in the comments down below or in the Discord group if you want to join there. That's linked below as well, what you thought about PENPAL. I really don't want it to come across as if I despised this book because I thought it could have used some editing. That's really not the case. I'm still thinking about it a lot. I get why so many of you guys love it and why it has a cult following. It just could have used a little bit of improvement. So I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you guys next Thursday.